Welcome to Policy Implications. In this podcast, we dive into new research in economics and finance and ask what it means for policymakers in the real world. This season, we focus on Ukraine, the war, the economy, and the institutions that will shape the country's future. I'm your host, Olha Zadorozhna, an economist working on Ukraine and Ukrainian myself. This series is supported by the Economists for Ukraine Network and Kozminski University. Today we are talking about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention: how Ukrainian refugees are helping the Polish economy. After Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, millions of Ukrainians fled to Poland and other countries. Public debate often focuses on the costs: pressure on schools, housing, social services, and the labor market. But a new working paper called Refugees and Entrepreneurship: Evidence from Ukrainians in Poland shows another side of the story. Ukrainians as business owners, job creators, and a boost to Polish entrepreneurship. My guest today is Pierre-Louis Vézina, professor of economics at King's College London, and one of the co-authors of this paper. Pierre-Louis, welcome to Policy Implications.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a basic picture. When people think about refugees, they usually imagine people in very vulnerable situations, relying on social support, not people opening companies in a new country. But your research shows that in 2022 and 2023, Ukrainians started tens of thousands of firms in Poland, and that they already account for a noticeable share of all new businesses. Could you paint a picture for us? How many businesses did Ukrainians start in Poland after the full-scale invasion, and what kinds of businesses are we talking about?
So if we look at the business registries, so when entrepreneurs register a business, they put it in a formal registry online. So this covers the universe of all firms registered in Poland. We found that there's 38,000 of them that were registered by Ukrainian owners. So that accounts for 7% of all the firms that have been registered in Poland in 2022 and 2023. So 7% of all firms, despite the fact that Ukrainian refugees are just around 2.6% of the Polish populations. So it's really all kinds of businesses, right? So you have sole proprietorships when it's just one person starting his own small firm. But you also have a lot of incorporated companies. So in 2022, for example, 5,000 incorporated companies were registered by Ukrainian owners. Um, all types of sectors. You have beauty salons, you have restaurants, you have bakeries, but you also have computer consulting firms, transportation firms, firms in constructions, and even manufacturing firms.
And what do you find about who is behind these Ukrainian firms? And how do you know they are actually refugees and not just long-term migrants?
Yeah, so this is something we wanted to find out, right? Because we know that in general, migrants are more entrepreneurial than the native born, right? Especially based on evidence from the US. So we wanted to know if it was really the refugees that were starting those businesses. And the registry doesn't include that information, right? It tells us that the founders, they tell us their nationality, their citizenship, they tell us if they're resident in Poland, but they don't tell us if they just arrived and if they registered as refugees. So to find out about that, what we did is that we ran our own survey. So we reached out to as many Ukrainian entrepreneurs in Poland as we could, and we got about 140 of them answering our survey. And what we found is that 58% of them, of the entrepreneurs that started businesses after the Russian invasion, had registered as refugees in Poland. What we also did is that we look at the correlation between refugees and Ukrainian firm creation across Poland's 380 counties. So the regions of Poland, and what we found is that where there's more refugees, there's also more firm creation by Ukrainian owners that boom at the same time as the refugee wave. So taking together kind of suggests that yes, the refugees are behind a large proportion of the firms being created. If we look instead at the correlation between pre-invasion Ukrainian migrants in Poland and new firm creation, we don't find a correlation, suggesting that it's much more likely that it's the new Ukrainian refugees in Poland rather than those that were there before the invasion that are starting those businesses.
So, a lot of the discussion in Poland has been about Ukrainians as workers. For example, people feeling labor shortages. And your paper adds a different angle, Ukrainians as entrepreneurs and people who create companies rather than just take these jobs. So, you link refugee inflows to firm creation in a systematic way. In simple terms, how do you show that the arrival of Ukrainian refugees actually leads to more Ukrainian firms being created in different parts of Poland?
So we know where refugees end up in Poland because they have to register locally with the social security system. And we also know the addresses of the firms that are registered. So this allows us to look at the correlation across counties to see if there's more firms being registered in location where there's more refugees that have settled, right? So, and we found that the two flows are indeed correlated. More refugees mean more firms, and this is true even if we look as refugees as a share of the total local population and Ukrainian firms as a share of total firms created, they're correlated. So more refugees, more firms. So this allows us to confirm that refugees are indeed especially entrepreneurial.
Interesting. And so you also show that areas that received more Ukrainian refugees didn't just see more people taking jobs, they also saw more Ukrainians starting companies. And refugees aren't only adding to the labor force, they're adding to the business fabric of the local economy, basically. Now we get into the politically sensitive question a little bit. And it is about people in many countries saying that when refugees or migrants start the business, they start to worry and they think, are they taking customers from us? Are they crowding out our own entrepreneurs? And your paper looks directly at this question. And the answer, at least in Poland, is quite striking. So, what happens to Polish firm creation in the places where more Ukrainian firms appear? Do Ukrainians indeed crowd out Polish entrepreneurs, or is something else happening?
Yeah, so this is indeed something we thought might be happening in Poland. So based on previous evidence from the US, again, mostly, so it is accepted that migrants are more entrepreneurial than the native born, but there's evidence that suggests that when there's more migrant entrepreneur, there's less entrepreneurship by the native borns. So migrant entrepreneurship reduces self-employment by by native-born Americans. So we looked into such effects in the case of Ukrainians in Poland, and what we found was the exact opposite. And we found the positive multiplier effect. So what this means is that where there's more Ukrainian businesses created, there's also more firm creation by Polish entrepreneurs in the same sector, in the same location.
Interesting. And so instead of Ukrainian bakeries replacing Polish bakeries, what your data show is more like more bakeries, more services, more local economic activity, both Ukrainian and Polish. But how big are these effects in practice? Is this something that only shows up in the statistics, or can we already see it on the streets of certain Polish cities and towns?
So we know there's like about 38,000 Ukrainian firms that were registered in 2022 and 2023. And what we found in terms of the multiplier is that for every 10 new Ukrainian businesses, there's four extra Polish businesses being created in the same location and sector. So it's quite a big effect, right? It might account for a large share, maybe around 5% of all the Polish firms created in that period. Now, do we see that in the streets? I mean, I think this is something you probably know more about than I do, but my impression after reading newspapers, The Economist, Euronews, we see news report about those businesses popping up in Poland. is that, yeah, you do see it. It's also what my co-author Piotr, who's based in Warsaw, has mentioned. You see them. What is especially visible, I guess, is the chains. So you see, for example, Nova Post. I've seen them in London as well. So I guess you see them in the streets in Poland. I've heard of Lviv bakeries as well, the Lviv croissant that make bakery chain. So I don't know. I guess you see it popping up in the street over there.
Oh yes, I can see it and I can confirm, especially the beauty industry, I think is booming. So indeed, I see more Ukrainian salons, but I also see more Polish salons opening up. And one of my favorite parts of your paper is that you don't stop at, yes, we see more firms, but you also ask why we see more firms. So, what are the mechanisms behind this positive effect on Polish entrepreneurship?
So one idea is that refugees, Ukrainians, they bring in new ideas, new ways of doing things, some form of innovation in businesses, and that gives local entrepreneurs also new ideas, to emulate, to create new businesses based on those new way of doing things. Sometimes that involves a lot of new technologies. So we know that Ukrainian entrepreneurs are tech savvy, and they brought a lot of those technologies with them to Poland, and that might have triggered new businesses. Another mechanisms would be linkages, right? So when you start a business or when you run a business, you buy a lot of parts and components of intermediates from other businesses. You also supply those intermediates to businesses. And that might have created businesses that are both upstream or downstream, or so buyers and sellers of those parts and components, if you want. So we did ask entrepreneurs in our survey if they did business uh, with Polish businesses around them. And what we found is that, yeah, 80% of them say they do. They both supply inputs and services to Polish firms, and they also buy from them. So we think that this is one way in which more Ukrainian firms might have triggered more business opportunities uh, in linking with the local Polish firms.
So Ukrainians aren't operating in a bubble, basically, but they are part of local business networks. They rent, they provide services, they buy from Polish suppliers, they create opportunities for Polish firms, well, to copy probably successful ideas or serve new customers. And do you see particular sectors where this cooperation and emulation are especially strong?
So this is something that is hard to capture, because the way we establish this multiplier effect is to look at variation across sectors, right? And to exploit that variation across sectors, it makes it impossible to focus on specific sector themselves. So we don't really know for sure, but there's got to be a way to figure that out. So we know in which sectors the Ukrainians were most active in creating businesses. We know that beauty salons is one of them. We know that construction is one of them, transportation as well. So we would think maybe that this is where there was also a positive multiplier effect. We're not sure yet, but there's got to be a way to find that out, and so we'll put that on our to-do list.
Oh, I hope you do have a continuation of this research. But this isn't what tried to connect research to the public conversation, to the stories people tell at home, in the media, and in politics. Right now, the public debate in Poland and in other EU countries often frames Ukrainian refugees mainly as a cost. They use schools, hospitals, infrastructure, they need support. And your work doesn't deny there are costs, but it clearly shows there are also benefits, especially when it comes to entrepreneurship and local economic dynamics. So, if you could change one thing in the public narrative about Ukrainians in Poland based on your findings, what would it be?
Oh, well, I mean, it seems the narrative is disconnected from the facts in general, right? Even if we focus on like the fiscal costs, that refugees contribute much more than they take in social benefits. So I think our job in academia, is to try to look at the raw numbers, the data, and establish facts that are true. And in this case, is that um, refugees is not an economic burden, right? Quite to the contrary, it's something that probably increases that makes the economy more dynamic. I understand that on average, the positive views that people have in Poland of refugees might have decreased. It was definitely a positive reaction, right? So this is really unique in history how people in Poland and maybe elsewhere in Europe as well were very welcoming to Ukrainian refugees and were said that it was the right thing to do to host them. So this might have declined over time. So you will have politicians that will blame any economic problems on refugees or on migrants in general. So I guess we have to continue to work hard to establish the facts, and they're not job takers. They're much more likely to be job creators, and they're not people who take a lot from the social security system, but quite to the contrary, they're net contributors. So I guess it's important to keep on reminding people that these are the facts.
Oh, yes, it is
Hopefully,
very important.
it will reach politicians at some point.
Indeed. And there is also a policy angle. These positive effects don't happen automatically. They depend on the rules and environment that refugees face in the host country. So if you were advising the Polish government or other European governments hosting Ukrainian refugees, what 2 or 3 concrete policies would you recommend to make it easier for refugees to start businesses and to maximize these positive spillovers for the host economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Polish and the European response in general was great. Refugees were allowed to work, they were allowed to start businesses, their children could go to school. Everything went much more smoothly than how it works with other refugee waves. If you look at Syrians, for example, most places they go to, they end up with this, they're stuck in the informal economy. They can't contribute. So it's important for people, for governments in general to realize that actually it's not, refugees are not a problem to solve, right? They're not a policy issue that requires tons of reports by experts and figuring out the right policies. If you do what the EU did for Ukrainians, you give refugees rights, you allow them to work, the rest is pretty much automatic. They will contribute to the local economy and they will integrate as well as they can, much better than if you try policies to manage them and resettle them in certain location, or you try to not allow them to work for a short period of time. All these things end up backfiring. The best thing to do is just to give them full full set of rights from the beginning, and the rest will work out.
Pierre-Louis, thank you so much for this conversation and for bringing real data into a debate that often is driven by fear and stereotypes. Your paper shows that Ukrainian refugees in Poland are not only workers or people in need of support, they are also entrepreneurs, job creators, and a source of new energy for the Polish economy. For listeners, we'll link the working paper in the description if you'd like to dig into the details. Pierre-Louis, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening and see you next time. This has been Policy Implications. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay tuned for more conversations on Ukraine's economy, institutions, and the challenges of reconstruction. I also encourage you to donate to support Ukraine. You'll find information on trusted ways to do so in the episode description.